over the years, when I have participated in orientations to newcomers, to UU congregations, as we will have later today here, in my role as minister, I usually give a very, very, very short and sweet history of Unitarian Universalism. And one of the many things I gloss over and mention in passing is that the Puritans were our direct ancestors on the Unitarian side. Yeah. And understandably, this is very surprising to newcomers and even to some old-timers sometimes too. How is it possible that Unitarian Universalism, this ultra-modern religious tradition, known for being liberal and flexible and permissive, the same religious tradition that brought us Our Whole Lives, or used to be called About Your Sexuality, Sex Education, and more, the same religious tradition that features in a chapter of the book The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, a chapter where at a UU conference they invited Ken Kesey and his merry pranksters to help them trip on LSD. How did this come out of Puritanism? 20th century writer H.L. Mencken famously quipped that Puritanism can be defined as the haunting fear that someone, somewhere, may be happy. Stereotype of Puritans, right? They were anti-pleasure, anti-joy, and of course very religious and strict. But is the stereotype true? Who were the Puritans? So the Puritans were people who left England to come to these shores in 1630 thereabouts because they took issues with certain things about the Church of England. They thought that the liturgy was too ornate and lavish, for one thing. They didn't like the system of bishops, for another. In essence, they thought that the Protestant Revolution, the Protestant Reformation, although it was a revolution, the Protestant Reformation should go further within the Church of England. So they had a sense that this was their calling, that they were chosen by God to establish a new, more truly Christian place. So they came here to the New World, and of course they wound up here in Massachusetts. To the stereotypes about the Puritans. In some ways they were, in fact, puritanical. They were ultra-serious about church, that's for certain. They had very definite ideas about what the right way to worship was. I'll share a few details. Their services were very basic and simple. The visuals were plain. They wouldn't have had stained glass. This is not an original, it's not our original church building, so they wouldn't have even had this amount of stained glass. They didn't have religious art, no statuaries, nothing like that. The singing was a cappella. They didn't want musical instruments. They didn't have piano. They didn't have organ. I'm pretty sure they would have frowned on ukuleles. The lyrics were straight from the Psalms, like the hymn we sang earlier. Puritan ministers preached for hours. And it was expected that those in the pews would pay close attention the entire time. If somebody started to doze off or talk to their neighbor, a deacon, and we still have deacons, I remind you, a deacon would whack the offender with a long stick. The Puritan church in this time was the town church, supported by taxes. And so they knew who was who and who should be there. And if a resident didn't show up on a Sunday, they would be punished. They would be maybe fined. They would be punished maybe publicly, put into stocks, let's say. And they were also serious about their polity, or their church governance. They didn't like the fancy, faraway system of a hierarchy. Instead, they had this very plain system of church governance that we now call congregational polity. So each congregation was its own sovereign body and answered to itself. Local Puritan congregations from the different towns could help each other out and keep each other honest, but that was all a voluntary system. Each congregation did its own thing, found and called its own minister. They didn't have a minister sent to them from a bishop. So far, as far as the polity goes, there's some obvious carryover between the Puritans and Unitarian Universalism today. There's this tendency away from elaborate ritual in worship. There's more focus on the words that are being read and said. There's a relatively unadorned worship space. And we have the congregational polity to this day. It is our official polity that each congregation is sovereign, does its own thing. Only voluntary guidance from other UU congregations and from the Unitarian Universalist Association. There's another similarity we have today to the Puritans, and that is an emphasis on education. All Puritans were expected to read the Bible, so education was emphasized for everyone. And because they wanted learned ministers, they founded a college in 1636, which they named after a Puritan minister, John Harvard, after he donated his library upon his death. There were a few other things about Puritans that go against stereotype. The Puritans did emphasize literacy, as I said, but they also believed in science. They thought that science was ultimately a way of studying God's creation or nature. So they were pro-science. They didn't see it as anti-religion. They were also, by the standards of the day, pretty good about educating women. Puritan women needed to be able to read and read well because they were the ones teaching scripture to their children. You'll note maybe the quotation in our order of service today by the Puritan Anne Bradstreet. She was the first published writer in North America, male or female. Puritans were also, perhaps surprisingly, not anti-alcohol. Actually, the Puritans made their own alcohol from hops and barley, but also corn and carrots and beets and pretty much whatever they could get their hands on. I suppose if Jesus could turn water into wine, why not? They were against drinking to excess, but they were not against drinking a little bit, a reasonable amount. Another example that's counter-stereotype, Puritans were not anti-sex. They were against sex outside of marriage, but once you were married, go for it. Married sex for Puritans was meant to be enjoyed. Now, it was common for them to pray before sex, but who am I to judge? So, based on those things, maybe it's not so hard to imagine that Puritanism evolved at some point to something else. But the biggest leap from Puritanism to modern Unitarian Universalism is really in the theology. The Puritans were strict Calvinists. And as strict Calvinists, they believed in the doctrine of total depravity, the idea that humans are born just innately depraved and sinful. They also believed in predestination, that God had already sort of preordained it all. And the most important practical ramification of that was that they believed God had already chosen who would be going to heaven. God had already chosen the so-called elect, or as some have called them, the visible saints. So according to Puritan beliefs, God, who knows everything, logically already knows who he will be saving. He doesn't have to wait and see how things will turn out. The elect are predestined to be saved. They are the few. So, for the Puritans, God has already decided who is saved and who is condemned. But how could we humans know if we were among the elect or not? Well, it turns out they looked for signs as to whether or not they seemed to be in God's favor, at least in this life. So what kind of signs? If things were going well for them, if they were procreating successfully, if they had good luck with their farming, their crops were doing well. When they cooked rice, it wasn't sticky. I don't know. Things went well for them. what we might call charmed lives. When someone was among the elect, they had a conversion experience. But don't picture speaking in tongues or writhing around on the floor. The Puritans weren't the types to go in for anything like that. Remember, they liked things simple. Their conversion experiences were kind of these slow motion things over time, where you kind of looked for signs along the way that you were leading a charmed life. So it was kind of like this weird Puritan predestination prosperity gospel thing happening. Very strange. Now, this conversion experience thing was important in a practical way because it was required for full church membership. So for the first generation of Puritans, remember they came here in 1630, this system worked out reasonably well. But the system broke down right away with the second generation already. The critical issue was you couldn't have your children baptized unless you were a full member of the church, and you couldn't be a full member of the church unless you could describe your slow motion conversion experience. So after a short time, you had adults in the church in that third generation who had never been baptized. Some second generation Puritans couldn't become members because they didn't feel they had these slow motion conversion experience. And this was a disaster for a community that really relied on church membership in every way to keep the order. These were the standing order churches. There was no real separation of church and state yet. So they had to do something. In 1662, they came up with an equally bizarre solution. They created the halfway covenant. It's kind of just as silly as it sounds. Basically, the halfway covenant allowed for partial church membership, in essence. So with this new system, a full church member's children could become partial church members as long as they followed the rules, even if they didn't have that conversion experience to share. They were partial church members, and they could have their children baptized. But they were partial church members, so they couldn't take communion, and they couldn't vote. But this system just never worked. It was controversial from day one, and lots of people, lots of Puritans in the second and third generations just rejected it all, just thought it was kind of a ridiculous compromise. So by the late 1600s, the religious zeal of the first generation Puritans in North America had already waned. By the end of the 1600s, you had the Salem witch trials, which led, understandably, to a lot of anti-Puritan sentiment. And so Puritanism was really kind of dying already by the time this town church was established in 1714. The people who established this church were Puritans, but in a time when it was already kind of dying. Another thing that was happening was a shift in the way the Puritans made their living. So originally they had been these godly, simple, sort of isolated farmers. But increasingly over time they made their money from commerce and trade, and they got into land speculation, tragically, of course, taking land from indigenous peoples. And in addition to the horrible violence, there was, of course, this growing worldliness and materialism among them. Later then, in the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution comes along and just exaggerates all of that. So the standing order town churches of the Puritans morphed into congregational churches that were quite different from the originals. Maybe it was inevitable. Lest we forget, the Puritans, for all of their conservatism, were rebels. They left England to come to a new continent to do things the way they thought they should be done. Congregational churches lived on in New England through all of these changes and challenges, but naturally they became less and less strict about membership. They retained the emphasis on education, a respect for science, and a general sort of reliance on reason. And all of these traits were the seeds that led to an increasingly liberal theology and rejection of Calvinism. Eventually, by the early 1800s, there was even disagreement within Congregational churches about the doctrine of the Trinity and whether that was really biblically based or not. So there was a schism. Some of the Congregational churches became Unitarian churches in name and theology, including this church. But some of them did not. Some of them retained the doctrine of the Trinity, and those Congregational churches in New England are now part of the United Church of Christ. So here in New England, Unitarian Universalist churches and United Church of Christ churches are very much first cousins, descended directly from the Puritans, and really only separating in the 1800s. Of course, in 1969, Unitarians merged with the Universalists, but that's really a story for another day, or a story for lunch today if you're attending FCU and U. So in closing, it's interesting to think about what we have retained from our Puritan roots, even hundreds of years later. We're still rebels. We still question authority. There's a comical and endearing carryover in that we still tend to be pretty staid in worship. We don't often clap or move around. We don't often call out to the minister when they're preaching.
Whoa.
Nice. We can be casual and silly and have fun. We tend to be still pretty reserved. We're still very interested in community and covenant with each other. It's still at the heart of a lot of what we do. We still covenant to lead better lives, to make a better world. We still gravitate toward covenants of accountability. And our own covenant says that service is our law, as I talked about a couple of weeks ago. And we still have a mighty righteous streak. It's just that it has more to do with social justice rather than issues of personal salvation and piety. So may we build on the best aspects of our heritage, but never be afraid to learn from our mistakes and our history. May we continue to defend education and science and reason in an era where they are increasingly under attack. Education and science, along with an emphasis on community, can make another world possible. Perhaps they will even lead us to a time and a world where people look back on the 21st century Unitarian Universalist movement and think it seems very quaint and backwards. I say, may it be so. Blessed be, and amen.